You know, sometimes in war, it's not the biggest weapons that change everything, it's the smallest ones. Tools so simple, so cheap, they look almost like toys. But in the right hands, they can stop giants. That's what happened in the dying years of the Second World War, when a desperate Germany armed its soldiers, even teenagers and old men, with a tube that could kill a tank. It was called the Panzerfaust, the armor fist, and it would change the battlefield in ways no one expected. Before we start this story, take a second to hit that subscribe button, give this video a like, and share it with your friends who love history. It really helps keep stories like these alive. Now picture this. It's late 1944. Snow is falling over a ruined German village. In the distance, the deep rumble of Soviet T-34 tanks shakes the earth. The villagers have already fled. The only ones left are a few scared young boys in ill-fitting uniforms, clutching strange-looking metal tubes on their shoulders. They've never seen battle before. Their officers have told them, wait until the tank is close, very close. Aim for the side and fire. The tanks come closer, their engines growling like monsters. The boys' hands tremble. Then one of them steps forward, lifts the tube, and squeezes the trigger. There's a sudden whoosh, a flash of fire, and a split second later, a Soviet tank explodes in a burst of smoke and steel. The boy's ears ring. He drops the tube, it's useless now, single shot, and stares at the burning wreck. He doesn't cheer. He just stands there, half in shock. That was the first time many German soldiers realized what the Panzerfaust could really do. To understand why this simple weapon caused such chaos, you have to go back a few years, to 1942, when the Wehrmacht faced a terrifying new problem. The Soviet T-34. When it appeared on the Eastern Front, German tank crews couldn't believe their eyes. Sloped armor, wide tracks, speed, power. It could shrug off most German anti-tank guns of the time. The early Panzer III and IV couldn't handle it. Infantrymen felt helpless. They had rifles, grenades, and courage, but none of that could stop a tank. German engineers had been experimenting with shaped charges, an idea that had come from explosives research in the 1930s. The concept was simple but brilliant. Focus the explosive force into a narrow jet of molten metal that could punch through armor like butter. The British called it the heat effect, high explosive anti-tank. The Germans called it holodum, meaning hollow charge. It was effective, but they needed a way for one man to deliver that power against a moving tank safely. In 1942, at the HASAG factory in Leipzig, an engineer named Heinrich Langwiller started tinkering with a disposable launcher that could fire a small warhead without complex machinery or recoil. He didn't want to build a rocket launcher like the Americans' bazooka. He wanted something even simpler. A cheap metal tube, a little black powder, and a warhead that could knock out a tank. The Panzerfaust was born. The first models looked crude. A short steel tube less than a meter long with a big bulbous warhead on the end. It looked like a plumber's nightmare, but it worked. The soldier would point the tube, fire the warhead, and throw the empty launcher away. No training, no aiming sights, no complicated maintenance. Just point and shoot. When the first Panzerfausts, called Klein 30 or Little 30, appeared in 1943, they could only hit targets about 30 meters away. That was dangerously close. But as the design improved, range doubled, then tripled. The Panzerfaust 60, introduced in late 1944, could hit tanks from up to 60 meters. And by then, its warhead could penetrate 200 millimeters of armor. That was enough to destroy almost any Allied tank in existence. German propaganda began calling it the wonder weapon of the infantry. Posters showed smiling soldiers knocking out tanks with ease. But on the front lines, it was no game. To get close enough to fire, you had to wait for the tank to come within a few seconds of crushing you. Many Panzerfaust gunners died before they could even pull the trigger, yet those who survived swore by it. There are countless battlefield stories about the Panzerfaust. In the chaos of the Eastern Front, entire Soviet tank columns were stopped by a handful of German soldiers armed with nothing but these tubes. One report from near Warsaw in 1944 tells of a group of SS troops who knocked out 15 Soviet tanks in a single engagement. At ranges so close, they could feel the heat from the engines. Another account from Berlin in 1945 describes a young Hitler Youth boy who destroyed a Soviet tank from inside a building window, just meters away. He was 13 years old. That's the tragic power of desperation. Germany's situation had become so hopeless that children were now carrying the fight, holding Panzerfausts taller than themselves. But make no mistake, the weapon worked. All wide tank crews came to fear it deeply. The thick armor of the Sherman, the Churchill, even the mighty IS-2, none of them were safe. The hollow charge could burn through armor, sending a jet of molten copper into the tank's interior, igniting fuel and killing the crew in an instant. Many Allied reports described seeing tanks explode without even knowing what hit them. The Panzerfaust didn't rely on velocity, it relied on chemistry. Unlike guns that needed heavy shells and powerful propellant, the shaped charge didn't care how fast it hit the target. The magic was in the warhead's design. A conical cavity lined with metal, focused so that when it exploded, the energy formed a superheated jet traveling at over 8,000 meters per second. For a split second, it turned metal into liquid and cut through armor like a knife through wax. And because it was disposable, it could be mass-produced by the millions. In fact, by the end of the war, Germany had made over 6 million Panzerfausts. They cost less than 5 Reichsmarks each, cheaper than a pair of soldiers' boots. Factories churned them out in basements, tunnels, and even schools. When other weapons were scarce, the Panzerfaust became the last line of defense. There's something strangely poetic about that. A mighty empire that once dreamed of thousand-year dominance, brought down to handing out simple tubes of death to anyone who could still pull a trigger. Yet it worked. For all its simplicity, the Panzerfaust reshaped how armies thought about infantry and armor. The balance had shifted. No longer could a tank just roll over soldiers with impunity. The little man now had a weapon that could slay giants. The Allied forces quickly took notice. American troops in France and Belgium began capturing Panzerfausts and testing them. Reports flooded back. Extremely effective, simple to use, dangerous backblast. They warned soldiers never to stand behind one when it fired. Some even joked that the Panzerfaust was so simple, a monkey could use it. But for the Germans, it was no joke, it was survival. By 1945, as Soviet forces closed in from the east and Americans from the west, the Panzerfaust became Germany's weapon of despair. In Berlin's final days, every corner, every basement, every ruined building held someone with one. Old men from the Volkssturm, boys from the Hitler Youth, and wounded veterans, all waiting for the next tank to rumble down the street. And here's the haunting part. Many of them actually succeeded. The streets of Berlin became tank graveyards, littered with wrecks hit by those little rockets. The Soviets lost hundreds of vehicles trying to break through the final defenses. That's the power of human will when backed into a corner. The Panzerfaust wasn't just a weapon, it was a symbol of Germany's last gasp. But before we move deeper into how this weapon changed modern warfare and influenced the future of anti-tank combat, if you're still here enjoying the story, take a quick moment to hit that like button. It really helps this channel grow and keep stories like this alive for history lovers everywhere. By early 1945, the Panzerfaust was everywhere. It had gone from an experimental tool to the most common weapon in the German army, issued in huge numbers to soldiers who barely knew how to use a rifle. Whole crates of them were handed out with a few sentences of instruction: point, aim, fire, and run. There were no manuals, no drills, no long training sessions. In the last desperate months, even civilians were shown how to use them. In some German towns, leaflets were dropped from planes teaching ordinary people how to ambush tanks. That was the level of desperation. But the weapon itself, it was brilliantly clever in its simplicity. Unlike the American bazooka, which was reusable and fired an electrically ignited rocket, the Panzerfaust worked on a completely different principle. It used a simple propellant charge, like a giant shotgun cartridge, that launched the warhead out of the tube. The warhead had its own fins, which popped out mid-flight to keep it stable. There was no rocket motor, no electronics, nothing complicated that could fail in the mud and cold. You fired once and the thing was done. One shot, one chance. The backblast was fierce. When the propellant ignited, flames burst out the rear of the tube, and any poor soul standing behind it could be burned alive. That's why soldiers were always warned to fire from cover and make sure no one was behind them. In the chaos of battle, though, that wasn't always possible. Many young gunners injured themselves or their comrades, and some of them never got a second chance to learn. Yet despite the dangers, the weapon's effectiveness was beyond question. A Soviet officer later wrote in his memoirs that his men were more afraid of the Faustniks, the German soldiers with Panzerfausts, than they were of machine guns. He said, "You could hear the hiss of the rocket, then the explosion, and the tank would stop, dead." Every crewman felt a chill whenever we entered a city street, because we knew they were waiting for us in every window. The Panzerfaust turned city fighting into a nightmare for tank crews. Streets that looked empty could hide death in every doorway. In Warsaw, Budapest, and Berlin, narrow alleys became ambush traps. A single soldier could change the outcome of a skirmish with one well-aimed shot. The weapon's range was short, but in urban combat that hardly mattered. The enemy was close enough to hear breathing. Still, what made the Panzerfaust truly terrifying wasn't just its power, it was its availability. When a weapon that deadly can be made cheaply and given to anyone, it changes everything. And it did. The Panzerfaust showed the world that high technology wasn't always the answer. Sometimes, Simplicity wins. Germany had spent fortunes building advanced tanks and jet aircraft, but in the end, one of its most feared weapons was a disposable tube made of steel and wood. Even Allied engineers were impressed. After the war, the Americans and Soviets both examined captured Panzerfausts in detail. They took them apart, studied the design, and soon began developing their own versions. The American M72 Law and the Soviet RPG-2, the ancestor of the famous RPG-7, were direct descendants of the Panzerfaust. You could say that nearly every modern shoulder-fired anti-tank weapon owes its existence to that little German tube. But back in 1945, that didn't matter much to the men who used it. For them, it was survival. There are letters from German soldiers describing the strange mix of pride and horror they felt when they first destroyed a tank. One young infantryman wrote, "I aimed at the turret. When I fired, there was fire and smoke. I saw the hatch blow open and a man crawl out burning. I had done what they told me, but I felt sick." That's the part history books don't always tell you. Behind every kill was a human face. Inside that tank were men just like them, trying to stay alive. And in that moment when the Panzerfaust hit, both sides were reminded how thin the line was between hunter and hunted. The Soviets tried different tactics to deal with it. They began using screens on their tanks, adding extra armor, or sending infantry ahead to flush out ambushers. In some cases, they'd fire entire buildings to the ground before moving in, just to avoid being hit by a hidden Panzerfaust. But it wasn't enough. In the ruins of cities, the Panzerfaust ruled. When the Red Army entered Berlin in April 1945, Soviet reports claimed that for every 10 tanks lost, at least 7 were destroyed by Panzerfausts. Think about that, 7 out of 10. Not artillery, not other tanks. Just one-shot, handheld launchers fired by half-trained boys and old men. That statistic alone shows how much damage a desperate defender can do with the right weapon. And it wasn't only in Berlin. In the West, American and British tank crews learned to respect and fear the Panzerfaust too. Near Aachen, several Sherman tanks were destroyed at close range by German infantry who'd hidden in basements and sewer tunnels. Some U.S. commanders even ordered their tanks to stay at least 100 meters from any building to avoid being ambushed. But in European towns, that was impossible. Every street corner could hide a Panzerfaust. There's a famous story from late 1944 when American troops advancing through the Huichen forest captured a young German soldier barely 16 years old. He was trembling, crying, and carrying a Panzerfaust that was almost as tall as he was. The officer who interrogated him wrote later, he had no idea how to fire it. They had given it to him and told him to stop tanks. That was his entire training. That boy never even pulled the trigger, but there were thousands like him who did. It's hard to imagine what it must have felt like to face a tank with just one shot in your hands. The noise, the fear, the shaking ground. And yet, again and again, they did it. Out of duty, fear, loyalty, whatever their reasons, they stood and fired. Some succeeded, some didn't, but all of them became part of the weapon's story. As the Allies closed in, Germany poured everything into producing more. Even when their factories were bombed, they moved production underground. They used slave labor from concentration camps, including prisoners who were forced to assemble the very weapons that might kill the soldiers coming to free them. That dark irony hangs heavy over the Panzerfaust's history. It was both an engineering marvel and a symbol of cruelty. But here's the strange twist. The same weapon that defended German cities also ended up helping the Allies later. After the war, thousands of Panzerfausts were left scattered across Europe. The Soviets captured huge stockpiles and sent them to their allies. In the early Cold War years, you could find Panzerfausts in conflicts from Finland to Korea, even in the hands of resistance fighters. They still packed a deadly punch. It's almost poetic, isn't it? A weapon designed to defend a dying empire ended up arming the very people it once fought against. History loves irony. Now, if you're enjoying this story so far, if you can almost see the streets of Berlin and feel the rumble of those tanks, take a second to subscribe if you haven't already. Hit that like button and share this video with someone who loves learning about the human side of war. It keeps this channel going and helps more people discover these forgotten stories. All right, let's move on. Because the Panzerfaust didn't just end with Germany's surrender. It left behind a legacy, a blueprint for how future wars would be fought. And that's where the story gets even more fascinating. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the world was left staring at mountains of wreckage, burned-out tanks, shattered cities, and the ghosts of millions. But among that wreckage lay something small, almost humble, a simple steel tube that had rewritten the rules of modern combat. The Panzerfaust had proved something frighteningly clear. You didn't need massive artillery or endless resources to stop armor. You just needed clever design and human resolve. All the great powers studied it. In the months after the war, American and Soviet engineers tore apart every Panzerfaust they could find. They admired its balance of simplicity and power. No moving parts to jam, no expensive sights, no fancy engineering. Just a shaped charge, a propellant, and a soldier willing to get close enough to use it. The Americans had already seen the limitations of their bazooka, which required batteries, wires, and careful handling. The Panzerfaust, on the other hand, could be fired by almost anyone within minutes of learning. The Soviets went a step further. They didn't just copy it, they improved it. By 1949, their engineers at the GSKB-47 Design Bureau in Moscow had developed the RPG-2, the first true descendant of the Panzerfaust. It used a reusable launcher, a rocket-propelled grenade, and a simple iron sight. A few years later came the legendary RPG-7, which would become the most widely used anti-tank weapon in the world. If you've seen news footage from any war in the last 50 years, you've seen the shadow of the Panzerfaust. Its DNA runs through every modern rocket launcher, from the American M72 Law to the Swedish AT4. But for all its influence, the original Panzerfaust remains something deeply human, a weapon born out of desperation, wielded by frightened people in hopeless times. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't glorious. It was a last chance made for a country that had run out of everything else. And maybe that's why it feels so haunting when you look at photos from 1945, images of frail men and boys standing in the rubble, clutching those tubes as tanks advance through the smoke. You can almost feel the fear in their eyes. There's one account that always stuck with me. In the final days of the Battle of Berlin, a Soviet war correspondent described a moment outside the Reich Chancellery. He saw two German boys, no older than 15, waiting behind a pile of bricks with Panzerfausts on their shoulders. The ground was shaking with the sound of T-34s. One boy fired and hit a tank, which burst into flames. The other boy froze. A shell exploded nearby and he fell. The Soviet reporter later wrote, "I remember thinking, they were brave, but they should have been in school." That line still hurts to read. When you study war long enough, you start to see how inventions like the Panzerfaust are both ingenious and tragic. Ingenious because they show how human creativity can solve any problem, even in chaos. Tragic because that same creativity is often used for destruction. The engineers who designed the Panzerfaust weren't thinking about politics or ideology. They were trying to make something that worked, something that could protect soldiers. And it did. But it also prolonged the fighting and gave false hope to those who believed it could turn the tide. In reality, nothing could. By the spring of 1945, the Reich was collapsing. Factories that once built Panzerfausts were now buried under bombed-out roofs. Supplies ran out. The Volkssturm militias that carried the weapons were starving, freezing, and exhausted. For them, the Panzerfaust was both a miracle and a curse, a weapon that could save their lives or take them in an instant. After the war, Allied forces collected thousands of them from the ruins. Many were dumped into rivers or melted down. Others ended up in museums. Some were kept by collectors, their paint still stenciled with words like Achtung, Feuerstrahl, warning, backblast. A few even turned up in strange places decades later, hidden in barns or attics, relics of a time when ordinary people were handed instruments of death. But the legacy of the Panzerfaust didn't end there. It shaped post-war military thinking. Armies across the world began to design weapons that gave the individual soldier more power. Suddenly, tanks weren't invincible anymore, and that realization changed everything. Military planners had to rethink how armor and infantry worked together. No longer could tanks rush into cities alone. They needed support, coordination, cover. That idea, born from the terror of the Panzerfaust, became doctrine in every army. It also raised uncomfortable questions about technology and morality. How far can a nation go when it's losing? When does defense become desperation? When you arm children with tank-killing weapons, are you protecting them or condemning them? Those questions hung over Germany for decades, long after the war ended. The Panzerfaust became a symbol not just of resistance, but of ruin. And yet, there's something undeniably fascinating about it. The weapon's design was so pure, so brutally effective, that even its enemies respected it. After the war, an American general reportedly said, "If the Germans had invented this 2 years earlier, the war might have lasted longer." That might be true, but it's also a chilling reminder that sometimes it's a good thing genius arrives too late. The Panzerfaust also had an unexpected afterlife. In 1948, during the First Arab-Israeli War, both sides used leftover Panzerfausts from German stockpiles. Later, in the Korean War, they were seen again, fired by Chinese and North Korean troops. Even into the 1960s, in far-off conflicts in Africa, dusty crates of Panzerfaust still appeared. A weapon built in a collapsing Germany had traveled across the world, outliving the regime that created it. That's the strange immortality of war technology. It never really dies, it just changes hands. But behind all the technical talk and battlefield stories, what really stays with you is the human side, the courage and fear of the men who used it, the terror of tank crews who saw it coming, the tragedy of a generation forced to fight in a war they didn't start, using weapons they barely understood. You can admire the engineering and still mourn the cost. In fact, you should, because that's what keeps history human. You know, if you've made it this far, you probably feel the same way I do. That history isn't just about machines or battles, it's about people. Their choices, their fears, their hopes. So if you want to keep hearing stories like this, real human stories from the past, make sure you're subscribed. Hit that like button if you haven't yet, and share this video with someone who loves understanding the why behind the weapons. It means a lot. Now let's bring this story home. The last recorded use of the Panzerfaust in World War II happened on May 2, 1945 in Berlin. Soviet tanks were pushing into the city center. Amid the burning ruins, a handful of German defenders fired their final shots. One of them hit a T-34 just outside the Reichstag. The tank burned for hours, black smoke curling into the night sky. The next morning, the war was over. For the men who built and used the Panzerfaust, there was no celebration, only silence. Many didn't live to see peace. Those who did carried the memory for the rest of their lives, the recoil, the fire, the sound of steel breaking apart. Some later said it felt like holding lightning in their hands. Others said they wished they'd never seen one. And maybe that's the lesson of the Panzerfaust. It showed what human beings are capable of, our brilliance and our madness all in one. In its design, you can see the mind of an engineer solving problems. In its use, you see the face of a frightened boy standing in front of a tank. The same object, two sides of the same coin. The Panzerfaust didn't win Germany the war. It couldn't, but it left behind something more lasting, a warning that even in our darkest hours, the tools we create to save us can also destroy us. That desperation can lead to invention, and invention can lead to tragedy. If you ever visit a museum and see a Panzerfaust behind glass, take a moment to look at it closely. It's small, rusted, ordinary looking, but it carries the weight of 1,000 untold stories, stories of bravery, fear, loss, and survival. The men who designed it are gone. The soldiers who carried it are gone. But the echoes remain in the weapons that followed, in the tactics we still use, in the lessons we still haven't fully learned. And as you walk away, maybe you'll think, as I do, that history isn't just about remembering who fought or who won. It's about understanding what it means to be human, even when the world has gone mad. That's the story of the Panzerfaust, the tank-killing rocket that shocked the Wehrmacht, changed modern warfare, and left behind a shadow that still lingers over the way we fight and the way we remember.